Very much welcome to this second pre-event of the Warp Space Summit. We have a third pre-event in a week or so, and then of course we have the Warp Space Summit on September 19th here in Linköping, but also online if you're not if it's not possible for you to travel to Linköping. But if you can go to Linköping, you definitely should. It's going to be an amazing experience here. And for the first time in many months, you get to meet people, 300 people at the same time. That's amazing in itself.
Yeah, it is, and it's sort of a weird selling point because it didn't used to be what people wanted to do. We're incredibly happy to have everyone here today. And what we're trying to do today is to give a bit of an odyssey through space, Sweden in space, so to speak, to give you a bit of an overview of what's been done and what we think should be done in the future. And to help us with this, we have a special guest, and I would like to welcome on stage Johan Gärdebo from Lund University. And you are a bit of an expert in the history of Sweden in space. Welcome.
Thank you, Carolina, for inviting me here. I use my phone to take notes, not because I'm distracted, in case you wondered. As mentioned, I'm a historian. Among other things, I've written a book on the Swedish space program. Space history is special in the sense that we usually talk about things that made it into space, whereas space historians like to talk about things that did not. So booster rockets that failed to ignite, that ignited but exploded, satellite solar panels that failed to fold out, satellites that didn't want to come down, satellites that went further out in space. All kinds of failures, basically. So traditionally, historians are a skeptical bunch. So when we get invited to optimistic events like the Warp Institute, we usually make odd bedfellows, but such are the times. And I'll try not to be that kind of historian today. Instead, I wish to offer an alternative to this success-failure dichotomy by suggesting first that fallibility is present in all technology, but also that our understanding of success is quite impingent on what we want the technology to do. So there are numerous examples of space technology that found other uses here on Earth, but the very presence of a space program, which is what we'll talk about today, is also about communicating to the world who we are. That is what Sweden is, and how Sweden is a space nation, which has importance for our relationship to other states. Space technology, in brief, is about more than outer space, even when the particular application happens to be a failure. Many of the people here today can tell you about the successes in recent years for Swedish space activities, so I'll focus on some of the applications that for a long time were considered failures, in particular satellite remote sensing. Since it tells us something about who we are, what has got us here in the first place, and why the Swedish space activities began back in the 60s. So, now I want to take you back to those 1960s, when the space activities were dominated by and associated with a Cold War power struggle between, on the one hand, the United States and the Soviet Union. It is in this setting that Sweden, a relatively small geopolitical player, began forming its first space program. The larger aim of the Swedish technological endeavors of this time was to ensure neutrality. That is, we subsequently built up radar installations, fighter jets, rocket technology, nuclear power, and also plans for nuclear weapons. And space technology were in this regard no exception. All catered towards securing Swedish neutrality in the event of war. The most evident example of us developing our own collaborations, our own technologies, was through collaborating bilaterally with other nations. And the most evident example is S-Range, that is the European Space Range in northern Sweden, Kiruna. And here we see a team of French engineers mounting what I believe is a Skylark sounding rocket to conduct experiments on the northern phenomena of Aurora Borealis. The Swedish space program was then intended, on the one hand, to maintain expertise in what was essentially military technologies, but on the other, use these for scientific purposes. And this dual use of the space program could be seen in how to develop a promising generation of young space entrepreneurs and engineers. And here we have a group of these people who together form what could be a Swedish equivalent of the RAND Corporation, albeit with far less money. The plans back in those days were to launch a Swedish satellite to develop telecommunication technology and remote sensing. So all those plans were already in place back in the 60s. But what was lacking was the funding. Lennart Lubeck, the gentleman second from the left here, was a pioneer of the Swedish space program and later the CEO of the Swedish Space Corporation. He told an anecdote that partly explains this problem. Lubeck had met at the Ministry of Finance trying to formulate a space politics. Whereupon the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Finance explained, space politics? What do you mean by space politics? We do politics in the morning every day. That does not mean we need to have a morning politics. What the Ministry of Finance clarified is the dilemma that has plagued Swedish space program until this day, I would argue. That space activities may be a means to an end. That is, you conduct activities through space. But it has never been about space. There existed plenty of space enthusiasts, to be sure, spread out across numerous research faculties, industries, government ministries, and authorities. And they did collaborate, but they did not represent a coherent political will in and of themselves. So in order for people like Lennart Lubeck to get money for space applications, they had to get good at formulating how these applications promoted other goals for Sweden. And during the late 20th century, these other goals were Sweden's attempt to remain a non-aligned state, to support developing countries in the third world, and to promote environmental diplomacy. Among the first major applications promoted by the Swedish National Space Agency and its forerunners were also satellite images for environmental uses. And at the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, Prime Minister Olof Palme held a speech emphasizing the role of satellite images not only to monitor but also to manage the Earth's environment. And Sweden later also took a leading role in formulating principles on how to use these satellite images for that very purpose. So in the process, Sweden also acquired satellite remote sensing capacity. That is, we built up a receiving station or several receiving stations in the far north at the S-range. So on the one hand, you could argue that Sweden is a natural home for these kind of satellites. They move from pole to pole as they scan the surface of the Earth below them and then return to the poles where the data can be downlinked. So from the satellite's point of view, the poles on the Earth are the home to which they return to after each orbit. But the reason why the Swedish Space Corporation could build up large business for space images was not because of this natural advantage that the Nordic has, but because they argued that the space images aligned to other concerns of the Swedish government at the time. That is, promoting Sweden and moral missions of being a neutral, non-aligned state safeguarding the Earth's environment, and also on behalf of third world countries. Among the more spectacular examples of this, I would call activistic attitude, was when Sweden was the first country in the world to promote satellite images of the Chernobyl disaster in spring 1986, which was argued to be neutral, non-aligned images as opposed to the news coming from the Soviet Union or the United States at the time. But the Swedish satellite experts also intensively sold in these images and promoted them throughout the world as a form of development aid. That is, you map developing countries using satellite images. And in order to finance that, you would then be able to use Swedish aid money coming, of course, from our tax revenues. And this continued from the late 80s to the late 1990s. All these Swedish efforts of using satellite images were hugely influential in shaping international perceptions of how you achieve sustainable development by technical means. That is, you monitor the Earth's environment in order to manage and safeguard it, which was also mentioned by Prime Minister Carl Bildt at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Carl Bildt is also perhaps one of the few politicians who has been truly enthusiastic, apart from Mathias, for space developments. But this has not been sufficient, safe to say. Because when the arms race of the Cold War was over, the tax revenue that had bolstered these kind of space activities dwindled. And subsequently, parts of the Space Corporation were sold off to other actors, most notably the Swedish Land Survey. And also the satellite imagery became part of other larger systems, most notably Geographic Information Systems, GIS, whose promoters not necessarily thought of themselves as developing space technology. So, the story ends at the turn of the millennium, where the pioneers of this space program thought of what they had done so far as partly being a failure. That is, satellite imagery and remote sensing not having achieved what they had hoped for, which would have been a sustained and cohesive effort of building up space actors who had then broken off into smaller entities. But as we'll return to discuss after the break, the Swedish space program did very much live on, but it would be so in a new era and with partly different rules to play. So that, Mathias, is basically the very brief summary of the space program so far. A lot of space enthusiasts who could collaborate and acted in a way as grey eminences, formulating policies on an ad hoc basis. Most notably, the notion of Sweden as a dual-use nation that is using both military technology for environmental means, but essentially lacking a space politics to lead that vision into the future.
All right, so now you can take 60 seconds. If you haven't said hi to the person next to you, say hi. If you had say hi already, you could ask the person if they want to go to space, if they want to go to the moon or Mars, or stay here on Earth.
Yeah.
So 60 seconds.
Find out.
Okay, how many want to go to space?
Show of hands.
That's not fair, Christer.
3 times is that? No, that's too much.
I want to go first before you go to third. Okay, how many of you going to space? How many want to go first to the moon? Okay, Mars. Somewhere else.
Anywhere.
All right, welcome back. We've heard a little bit about Swedish space history. Now we're going to focus on the future. The mission of Warp Institute is to make the future come sooner. That's not easy, but I think if we can gather many optimistic, forward-looking people from all over the world, ideas are going to form, like at the Space Summit now. We're going to see ideas be born, and out of those ideas there will be companies and projects and things like that. That will move things forward. And I think space is a perfect example of this. When humanity tries really hard, we can do things very fast and make progress really, really fast, and really impressive progress. So of course in the 60s, with the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, there was an enormously rapid improvements, and we landed, landed a person on the moon in just a few years. Do you know, not you, Christer, do you know when a human was last on the moon? Do you know what year? 1972. 1972, almost 50 years ago. Was that because we forgot how to go to the moon? No, we stopped trying. If you would have asked someone in the late 70s or early 80s maybe or something like that, where do you think humans are going to be in 2021? They would say, Mars, a long time ago, way out there among the stars. But we stopped trying, so that's why we haven't made that kind of progress. So progress is not automatic, and someone has to create it. And it's not just one, it's not just a government or one person. One person can do a lot, but it's together with others, and that's what we want to do at the Warp Space Summit. So that's why we're so focused on the future. But it's also great to look at the history and what we've done so far, and then we're going to, from that, create the future. So now, next, we want to talk to one of those pioneers, the first Swede in space. Welcome up, Christer Fuglesang.
So, a few years ago, I was in politics. I realized that Sweden doesn't really have a space policy. We do a lot of stuff and a lot of good things, but there's no vision, really. And we heard that from Johan Gärdebo previously. Space is, in that kind of space policy or where we spent money, space has not been the prime goal of that. It's been other things. So we collaborated a bit, and I talked to a lot of people in Swedish space, and we came up with some proposals. More astronauts. We think astronauts is a great inspiration in itself, and they do a lot of good when they are in space with the research. We also said we want to put a Swede on Mars in the 2030s. Do you see anyone going there soon?
Well, soon and soon, but I see that people will go to Mars probably in the 2030s, 10 to 15 years from now. It's unlikely that the first person will be Swede, unfortunately, but eventually there will be a Swede among these people, absolutely, that I'm sure about.
So what do you see for Sweden, what do you see the big opportunities now in space? What should the vision be, and how do we get there?
Well, there's so many. There's a tremendous development in space activities and space business now, and the really big change is that from being dominated by government money, government programs, things like that, now it's becoming more and more entrepreneurs, new startups. They're cheaper and cheaper to send things to space. So there's an opportunity to build a space business, all the way from small things which you put on a rocket to help, or a satellite build. For example, I had a couple of students from KTH who kind of got an idea. They want to invent a little bit more micro engine for a satellite, electrical propulsion. KTH Space Center is supporting little money. They were testing out in the summer, and now they have a little space startup company. Unfortunately, they moved to Finland because they couldn't get the support investment money here, so that's a little bit sad. But that's it. Man can build rockets. We are developing now the S-range to really launch satellites from there, and there finally the government is taking it, what I think, responsibility, or that's maybe stupid, not responsibility, but they realize that here is an enormous advantage for Sweden, that we have this, not only can receive data from satellites here, but we can also utilize the big empty areas to kind of launch to space. Could it be the first place in Europe where we can launch satellites, depending on how aggressive some other countries are, like Norway.
Right.
Yeah, so there's so much. I can continue, but maybe the next question.
Yeah, it's good, but I think a lot of people here, like in the audience, pretty much everybody knows who you are because he's sort of famous in Sweden. But if we have some people that are listening from abroad, so would you just do a little short presentation of who you are and
Sure.
and what your vision and motivation has been?
So my name is Christer Fuglesang, and originally a physicist. Became an astronaut for European Space Agency in 1992, and eventually made 2 space flights in 2006 and 2009, so far, with the space shuttle Discovery to the International Space Station. Back in Sweden since 2013, and now a professor at KTH, where I'm doing space travel and some research, some teaching. I'm very much, let's say, trying to help all space activities in Sweden to happen, and we develop new technologies and new programs here and things like that. I have another favorite idea, I think, needs to be examined, and that is actually if I could put big sunshades in space, that if really need be, we could use that to kind of keep the temperature not increase too much on Earth, which would use solar sailing, which is another very exciting space technology, which I think we should develop anyhow.
So another thing is you sort of went on a government space flight, but we see more and more private space flight. We've seen really rich people go to the International Space Station, for example, 20 years ago. But now we see sort of a new era. We've seen just recently 2 billionaires going to space. But is that something Sweden could be in, private space flight? And sort of what's behind the billionaires here going to space? What are they really doing up there? Is it a toy for them, or what do you think it is?
So, to start with the second question, for the billionaires, it's not a toy. I mean, they are really true believers in that space is something good for the humanity. In particular, Jeff Bezos. He has the vision that in the future will be kind of big space cities. This kind of old idea of a torus which circulates to get artificial gravity. And he kind of likes to say that, well, I became rich because I could use an infrastructure which was existing, the internet. That made me make my money. I want to create that infrastructure in space for future generation, future entrepreneurs to kind of use that infrastructure. So he sees billions, well, at least millions of people living in this. Branson, I think he more saw a business opportunity actually there. That's nothing. But coming to Sweden, sure, we can do this in Sweden also. I in particular think that at the S-range, the technology style which Jeff Bezos has with rocket just goes up, and then you have a capsule, and you have people there watching the space for some minutes, come down with parachute, and the rocket goes down there again. That's probably the best one. And I think
could we do that from S-range?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can see the Aurora. And I think there's possible companies, Swedish, who could do that. We have this space entrepreneur entrepreneurs Tina and Tom Sjögren, who's working in California, but they're trying to make a kind of their business both in California and in Sweden, and developing a rocket, which they eventually actually see sending people to Mars. But there could be a middle step there where you could have this as a business opportunity in Kiruna or S-range.
So just two brief things on what you mentioned there. So Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos, they eventually want to develop those O'Neill colonies or O'Neill cylinders, gigantic space colonies up there. So one of your mentors, Sven Gran, is coming to the Space Summit. He's going to talk about those O'Neill colonies. So when and the second point was that I visited Blue Origin a few years ago, and I asked them, so is this something you only going to do in the US, or could you expand to other countries? And I said, I don't want a polite answer, give me the real truth here, could that be a possibility? Could Sweden be a possibility? And he said, yes, absolutely. Of course, we're going to start in the US, build up the business there, but we're going to have more places than just the US to launch people from. So then S-range could be one. But what's the point with private space flight? Well, go up there. That's of course amazing, but
if we want to expand human activities in space, so there's no way that could be just funded by government money. There's no reason for governments to put a lot of money. You asked, you had one kind of argument for why we didn't, or asked why didn't we continue to go to the moon and all that. I think as a historian, you have to ask, why did we go to the moon? That was not because the government thought that we're going to explore the moon, and that's why we put these billions of dollars in. No, it was for politics on Earth. We need to show the world that we are better than those commies, and we need to show that for ourselves. And that's why the US went to the moon and put all this money into it. And when they've done that, they realized, we cannot sustain this. So they thought they could make a smarter way of going to space by building the space shuttle first. And that was a miscalculation also, because space shuttle never became cheap and safe. So we'll never be able to really develop human activity in space with just government money. So that's why it is so important and good that it is now happening, that entrepreneurs sees a way how you can actually make money by even human space activities, combined with definitely a big portion of idealism, I would say, from Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I mean, they're putting in money also. I think that they're willing to kind of put money which they, so to say, lose, because they see a higher goal to do this. It's good for humanity in their eyes. Well, I agree also about that.
We're going to invite a couple of more people, but before that, I also want to mention, you mentioned Tom and Tina Sjögren. So they have a company called Python Space in California. They're from Sweden. They're explorers. So the first exploration they did, they climbed Mount Everest, summit Mount Everest. Then they did a
unsustained. That was it.
Right, and they've
unsupported. Sorry, wrong.
They've done a ton of other crazy things here on Earth, but they sort of ran out of exploration here on Earth. So they said, is there something out there instead? So they want to go to Mars. So they're building the rocket, and they're building the capsule for that, and starting a company. So they're going to come to the Space Summit and talk about that. And the first thought when I heard, I met them at one of your lectures, and I was like, they must be crazy. But then you talk for them for 10 seconds, and you realize, okay, they're really into this, and they're really knowledgeable. So maybe a Swede could be first on Mars.
Doesn't mean they're not crazy, though.
Could.
They could be crazy also. Yeah.
This is the fabulous thing about it, though. You call it idealism, and that's maybe one way of putting it. But it's this pioneership that we see in a lot of these people that is bringing it forward. Yeah. And we have that not just in the manned spaceflight. We also have it in a lot of other fields where people are really pushing the limits of what is possible to do, whether it is within traveling to Mars or solving the problems that we have on Earth right now. So there's a lot of these kind of discussions to take as well. We have a couple of experts with us. Should we invite them up as well? Jens Birch, would you like to join us? And also we'd like to invite back Johan Gärdebo, because you not only being a historian, you also have a lot of insight into sustainability. So we're going to move on to that a little bit as well. But I'd like to start with you, Jens. Would you just do a brief presentation of who you are, and also what do you do on a daily basis? Like, what's your job?
Sure. So I'm Jens Birch. Today I'm a professor in material science here at Linköping University. And basically you can say I'm an expert in making new materials with properties according to wish. So if someone comes with a space project, they need special properties for their material, I'm very glad to take on such a task. I've done other big projects with ESS, for instance. Linda can tell you more about that later, and so on. And I can also say that I was going to apply for the same job as you got. I was a PhD student at that time, and unfortunately my wife convinced me that it would be better to stay on Earth with my two newborn kids at that time. So
Well, it's lucky for you, Christer. That would have been a bit of a fight, I think.
Yes. My wife was a little bit more bold, I guess. We also had two newborn kids.
Yeah. So I've had a long interest in space and wanted to go to space in a long time. I guess this is a short presentation of what I'm doing.
Thank you. And Johan, we'd like you to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself as well. We've heard a little bit from you, but also what you do today when you're not doing space research.
Sure. Yes, I have no claim to space as these two gentlemen. But I work here also at Linköping University on climate transition policies. That is how you phase out carbon from industrial processes. So in Sweden, you could think of refinery in Primraf in Lysekil, or Hybrid in at SSAB in Luleå, or Cementa with CCS technology. So basically, I go to the workers of these places and the business leadership and ask them about these questions, what transition policies mean for them. So my method is basically I have a fika with older men, which is not too different from how I wrote my dissertation on the space program. Yeah, I'll stop with that.
Okay.
Thank you
That's
very
awesome.
much.
Yeah.
But we're glad to have you because I think this is this question with sustainability and space is something that we also need to approach. It's a lot of very, very important questions to delve into there. But first of all, we'll go back to you, Jens, I think, because you have a project that we'd like to hear a little bit more about.
Okay, I mean, this is one of the latest and one of the smallest projects we've had, which was together with IRF in Uppsala. Yeah. So basically, they needed a special material that would they have defined very special properties. It's going to be sent out to Jupiter, and in the vicinity of some of the moons of Jupiter, it's going to collect ions that comes from the sun. And there will be 4 of such probes to collect ions so that they can map out basically the aurora around those moons. And the outcome of this, I mean, it's going to be sent up next year, and it will arrive in Jupiter in 2029. The outcome will tell us if there is ice in the core of those moons or if it's liquid water, and a lot of things that can be interesting for future space exploration to know. What I learned from that experience is that there are so many properties of the materials that go into space that are not evident at first sight. For example, it's very cold out there around Jupiter, but these coatings, they need to sustain 600 degrees. Why? Well, they go into the sun and orbit that, or make a slingshot around the sun first. So it means that you cannot take any material. And we have a number of very, very strict requirements on space materials. And thanks to that, I think we can learn how to make exotic materials that we don't need on Earth, but I think maybe a fraction of those will be very important for us in the future to reduce the carbon monoxide emissions and maybe even to capture carbon monoxide, or to make other things more efficient on Earth, because the future will have higher demands on the materials. So that's why I like space projects.
So this project is called JUICE, right?
Yes.
It's part of the European Space Agency. So yeah, like you said, it's and if you could elaborate a little bit on that, the latest point you made here. So when you send something out in space, you have to develop something for the space environment, go close to the sun, and then go out where it's really cold. You have to push technology forward a lot, and could seem pretty pointless, but there are some benefits even here on Earth, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is evident from past materials development for space. I mean, solar cells, we would have been 30 years behind in the race for capturing energy from the sun if we wouldn't have space programs in the 60s and 70s. So that is a very simple example, and there's numbers of examples, and the imaging which is now, like you see on Google Earth and on Google Maps and all those images, but it is so much more advanced than we see by the naked eye, and we can use that to actually plan the future in a good way, and we can learn about the past also by looking at the images backwards. So I think. Was that a question to your answer? Or answer to a question?
Exactly. It was.
Yeah.
Johan, so far you talked about Swedish space history. What do you want the future to be for Swedish space?
One of the things to take away from the past, I think, is this notion of the Swedish neutrality, because it also has resemblance with regards to what country can do what things, basically, who is credible in the eyes of the public opinion. And I came to think of the plans to do the solar radiation experiment in Kiruna this summer, which was stalled, if I'm not mistaken. Sweden is perhaps one of the countries where you could profess that this technology has benign purposes, because we also have a heritage of conducting such technologies. So I think how we develop our collaborations with other countries is in effect more enabling than would be in other places. So I think that's where history can serve as any kind of guide. But with regards to what Sweden should do, I think one of the contradictory terms here is that if you look at the transition sector, the state is taking an increasingly activistic or entrepreneurial role than has previously been the case. Whereas in space you see the opposite. You have companies taking the mantle in a way. But they're doing so in a way by emulating states. That is, I mean, if you take Jeff Bezos' spaceflight, he had a cowboy hat. This might seem like a coy detail, but the fact that he's also resembling American culture is also legitimates why he can be there in the first place. So in the beginning of the space age, you would have states posing as agents of humanity. Now we have companies posing as the agents of their nations. I'm not saying this as primarily as a criticism, but rather to point to the fact that in addition to the technologies and the materials, we need to have overarching narrative that is legitimating for these enterprises. In a way, myths that we can believe in, and more so we need to believe in. And I think Sweden has some of the myths that we could dig up and fill with new content. But otherwise, historians are poor guides for the future.
Okay. Aren't you supposed to learn from the history?
So it's not to repeat it, but we're going into uncharted territory.
Okay, yeah.
That's what this is about, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that we want to highlight at the summit is those kind of space is not just rockets and astronauts and engineers. It's of course that there's a huge part of space, but it's also sort of more indirect things like the things you're doing, Jens. So another area. So when you go out in space, there are some big things out there, but also some tiny particles out there that could be, at that speed, it could be really dangerous. That's also something you worked a bit on.
Yeah, that's one side effect you can say. We are working on thin coatings that today they are put on tools to cut metal, and they are now, if you have seen a cutting machine today, the chips that come out of the iron pieces, they are glowing white because of the speed that this is being cut, which means that the coatings that we put on the tools is there to protect the tool so that it doesn't get blunt. And this kind of hard, very resistant coatings, they can also be used to protect against micrometeorites, for instance, or other abrasive wear where you don't have lubricants and so on. So it can be a protective. It can be used as a protective coating in space, for instance. And we also work on other materials which are also nanotechnology based, where we can deflect energetic particles like neutrons and protons, which are also quite frequent in space. But we are develop them for projects here on Earth, like the ESS, for instance.
So when we go to space, when we do new things in space, there's a lot of problems we have to solve all the time. Pretty extreme problems that we might not have solved if we just stayed here on Earth. So, Christer, when we're going to Mars, we're gonna need to solve a lot of those kind of big problems. What do you see sort of the big task that we have to solve to go to Mars, to send humans to Mars, not just robots?
Yeah, there are a couple for sure. Today, with today's technology, one-way trip to Mars takes at least 6-7 months. If we could find better ways to propel ourselves through space, new rockets for space, for example, and get that down to order weeks instead, 6-7 weeks, and there are prototypes which could do that. That would be a great, enormous step forward, because that means you don't need to set as much food there. You don't need to have as good systems. You could actually even go abort and come back. Today, if you start your engine and get the speed you need towards Mars, you cannot come back until you just kind of gone around the moon and Mars and come back. Similar what happened at Apollo 13, actually. They had an explosion on their way to the moon, but they couldn't turn around. They had to go around the moon and then come back. You need a life support system to keep people alive safely for this long time. And we are practicing developing these things a lot on the International Space Station. But if something breaks there, I mean, it's fairly easy to send up a repair kit. Or if things are really bad, they have their lifeboats there, so to say. They can be back on Earth in a few hours. Then it's the radiation, which mentioned. Radiation is not only bad for electronics and surfaces on satellites, it's also bad for humans. So you can get cancer over time, or you can, if there's a big solar eruption, you can even get acute radiation problems. One of the ways to solve that is really to go faster. It's very hard to build a spaceship which has thick enough walls to protect you over time, indeed. Once you're on Mars, though, then you can dig yourself down in the soil or something like that. So that once there, it's not too bad. The logistics in the beginning to send all the food and all the things over to Mars to keep the people alive there until many decades, I guess, you maybe can get started, get something going to do. You make your own food there. Better system which what do you call it? Gain back the water and the recycling system for kind of you use the water in the body, you get it back and can use it again on the ISS. We have about 90% recycling now. Carbon dioxide is a little bit tougher to regain back the oxygen, for example. That's another challenge. Plenty of challenges, but I think they will be solved in about 10 years, so we can go there.
So, Johan, do you want humanity to go to Mars? First send humans there, and should we also live there? Should we have a city or cities on Mars?
You mean my preference for where humanity should be? Well, this, I guess, is where we go into philosophy. Because when the satellites were launched in the late 50s, philosopher Hannah Arendt also reflected that this will diminish what she called the stature of man. By that she meant our place in the universe as we understand it ourselves, which is an existential question for why we live, why we get up in the morning, why we struggle with the things with which we struggle, what motivates us. If you're talking about life on Mars, then we are in a completely different environment from where we draw most of our existential angst and motivations. That's, I think, having that recognition and assuming that by going to another planet, I think is the best preference you could get for what to do. But whether or not we should be there or not, I can't really say. But I will change what is our philosophical place in the universe, for sure.
This is a very interesting point you're making, though, and I think that's something that we need to remember when we talk about this, is that it is very easy to make this sort of an existential question. If you ask the audience here, do you want to go to Mars or not, you usually get around 50-50. You don't get people saying, no, I haven't really thought about it. Either you go, yes, I'm going to go, or absolutely not. And maybe that is also something that we need to take in consideration when we talk about these questions, is that there's a lot of philosophy or identification behind it, and if you're interested in space or not. And not all these questions that we have talked about today has space as a main preference. Like a lot of these things can also be used here to solve some of the problems that we have here. But we have to have the courage to join the pioneers and to join these people and say, okay, so we want to see these applications and see what they can do.
Do you want us to have? Sorry.
It's a difference in going to somewhere and moving there and stay there.
Yes.
Because this seems to be now a little bit different. I mean, I'd love to go to basically every country in the world and look at it, but there's not many countries I would like to move to.
That is a good point.
Yeah, so I
But
don't
not
want
all-
to move to Mars. No.
But I think not all space exploration is about moving to Mars either. But it is a very good point.
no,
Like
but,
that is an added sort of. But what about O'Neill colonies? Like just a couple of months, a year, summer in space.
Yeah. No, definitely. I'd be happy to have it. No, I think the point is not what so many people want to do. The point is that there are for sure people who would be extremely willing to move to Mars. Maybe it's only 1 in billion, but that means out of 10 billion people, 1 in million, out of 10 billion people, there will be still thousands of people who want to move to a new place and try a new kind of way of living and be the pioneers to start a new kind of a colony for humanity. So I think that's the way to look at it, and I don't agree with you on that. It kind of puts humanity in another philosophical world. What I think will be more maybe harder for people is to see if you find life in another place in space, in particular if you find another intelligent life.
You see, this
Then
is
I
interesting.
think that will be.
I'd like to hear the panel's view on this. I know your view. But you start, yes. So is there life on other planets?
Of course, it is.
Of course there is.
And simple life, it's just a question of time. You need a little bit better instruments, or we are lucky and we find it maybe on Mars or on one of the Jupiter moons. Simple life. Yeah, but that would be enough to prove that it's not only originating at Earth. Intelligent life, I'm also convinced that there is somewhere, but it might be so rare that we never will meet it. Actually, I think there's good reasons to believe that we might be the only one in our galaxy, but so we'll never see another, but I'm sure there are.
What about the other? What do you think?
I'm totally convinced that there is intelligent life in the universe. If you think about it, if you think that the universe is infinite, and you think about what is infinity, then we should have infinite number of copies of ourselves in the universe. So basically, I think it's inevitable with the size of the universe and the different conditions that are at so many places that life has developed. Maybe they have killed themselves on the way. I don't know. Some of them.
Yes.
Johan, what do you think?
I'm primarily concerned with intelligence on this planet, not to find it, but basically.
You're still looking for it here?
No, but as you point to, Christer, obviously I'm concerned with the human condition. But what I mean by the intelligence on Earth is that the humanistic project, which is what history is part of, is basically to try to understand who we are and what our society is. And one of my concerns right now is this: we seem to lack this overarching story of where society is going. In a way, it's perhaps even more so since the end of the Cold War, because before that you had a dividing ideological line, and now it's more blurred. And the pursuit for space, I think you said one thing, you said several things were interesting, Mathias, but one thing I want to pick up on was that there's no contradiction in going to space and caring about Earth on life on Earth, which I think it carries a lot of wisdom in the sense that when societies on Earth experience trauma, that is a horizontal decrease of possibilities or ecological loss, I think that the pursuit for transcending logic of society, of going towards the stars or maybe down towards the Earth, will increase. So it's not so much that the people who do this, which happen to be billionaires at the moment, are escaping some kind of trauma. They're rather pointing towards the need to address this kind of ecological issue that we have going on at the moment. So I think we shouldn't be against spaceflight. Rather, it should be one of many attempts of dealing with these societal and philosophical issues that we're experiencing right now. and might carry some of the solutions in them as well.
Jens, you had a report.
Yeah, I had a little. I wanted to latch on to this. What kind of people that would like to go to space, and I think it's important we have these enthusiasts and people who are burning for something really, really impossible and are willing to do whatever they can and spend as much money as they can to do something more or less impossible, because that means that we are doing impossible things at Earth for no reason, really. But we can use the results when they have gone. We can use what they have developed for other things, because it's so difficult to do what they want to do that we can harvest a lot of knowledge from that, which we can use for sustainable technology, for example, and so on. So I think it's important that we have these people who actually want to do things that are seemingly crazy, like these climbers.
So I keep popping up and advertising the Space Summit. So I think all these kind of perspectives, we had a few of these perspectives here. So we're going to bring a lot of different perspectives, how teachers can add to this, if you're making computer games, how you can add to this vision in space. And one of the most interesting things on the summit is going to be on alien technology. So we have a Harvard professor, Avi Loeb. As you might remember, a big cigar traveled through the solar system a few years ago, or at least what we thought it looked like. He's one of the world's leading astrophysicists, Avi Loeb, and he's convinced that the most likely explanation is that is alien technology, and it's a alien solar sail that sailed through the solar system. So it's not just something he picked up at an internet forum somewhere and said, that sounds great. This is one of the world's leading astrophysicists, so that's super interesting to hear his view on that at the summit. Should we round this up with a final question to the panel? You can repeat yourself if you want, but I want to ask you, so if you have to pick one thing that is, the biggest opportunity or the most important thing that Sweden should do in space next, what should that be? We start with you, Christer.
Develop S-range as soon as possible, and make sure we also can build our own rocket to send satellites from there. Then we will have the whole chain for everything in space in Sweden, from building rockets to satellites and launch it, to take down the data, to control it.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not a space person in that sense, so I don't know the details of these things. But I would say it's important, learning from history, is that we actually collaborate with the whole world around space projects, so that we don't lose it again, as you described when they split the company previously. So it has to be a worldwide collaboration if Sweden is going to succeed.
Johan?
Well, if we look at what Swedish society is apart from space enterprises, we seem to want to get to know each other quite a lot and agree a lot. That has some downsides, but with regards to the space enterprise, it really is part of why it could sustain itself for so long. The question is not why we built it, but why it stayed so long. And one of the explanations I think that could be dug into further, which you pointed to, is that many of the space enthusiasts knew each other by first name basis, and they collaborated. They might not always have had the same views and goals, but they recognized that without each other, there would be very little impetus for this country to do that otherwise. I see no reason why it shouldn't be the case today. And neither should those friends only be found within governmental authorities.
Right. Give a big round of applause for Johan, Christer, and Jens.
We're incredibly lucky that we have just such a forum that Johan is talking about, because we're going to gather all these space enthusiasm in just 1 month time here in Linköping, and we certainly hope that we will see quite a few of the people here and the people watching at home there as well.
Thank you so much for joining us, and see you soon again.
Thank you.